Hello and welcome to this Theatre Green Book training in association with Performing Arts Forum, Green Arts Initiative and CCI SkillNet. My name is Sinead Wallace. I'm a lighting designer and sustainability advisor working in theatre in Ireland. And thank you for joining us on this operations training webinar this morning. The aims of this training are to understand the principles of sustainable theatre making, to plan and measure actions to move your organisation or work practice towards net zero, and to plan a production to Theatre Green Book basic standard. And this webinar in particular is focused on the operations end. So to get us started, let's just have a moment to consider what sustainability is, because sustainability does not exist in isolation. The UN defines sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And according to the UN Environment Programme, environmental sustainability involves making life choices that ensure an equal, if not better, way of life for future generations. So environmental sustainability aims to improve the quality of human life without putting unnecessary strain on the Earth's supporting ecosystems. So I think we're all aware by now from headlines over the last few years of the situation we're in terms of climate change. And we can see from just these headlines taken from newspapers across Ireland and the UK that climate change affects everyone and it affects every system. It affects healthcare, migration, food security. So it is a social justice issue as well as just an environmental issue. Looking at the floods in Spain earlier in summer 2024, we very much never thought this could happen here. And it was as a result of increased rainfall and increased sea surface temperatures in the Mediterranean. So we saw record high water temperatures across the Mediterranean. More than 90% of the additional heat from greenhouse gases has been absorbed by the oceans. And when the oceans hold when the atmosphere holds more moisture, it leads to more intense rainfall events. 2023 was the hottest year on record globally by a large margin, but 2024 is on track to surpass it. So we're on the cusp of global average temperatures being 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, and this is considered to be a critical threshold in global efforts to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The aim of the Paris Climate Agreement has been to curb average temperature increases to 1.5 degrees, and we're almost already there. So I think by now we accept that climate change is fueled by human activity. The causes of global warming are greenhouse gas emissions largely. So we look at CO2, carbon dioxide, so the burning of fossil fuels in industry, transport, deforestation, because trees are carbon sinks, they hold carbon. When they get cut down, they release carbon. When they get burnt, they release carbon. Nitrous oxides in agricultural processes such as in fertilizers, F-gases in things like aircon, and data centers, which use a lot of energy. And only a small percentage of our grid is renewable, so it's a lot of fossil fuels being burnt for data center energy as well. So when we talk about carbon emissions, when we talk about greenhouse gases, we tend to divide them into three scopes. So we talk about scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. Scope 1 emissions from burning fossil fuels in your buildings, offices, in your theatres, so they're direct emissions from gas boilers and oil-fired central heating. And how we can tackle those is to move away from fossil fuel-powered heating. Scope 2 emissions come from electricity generated in fossil fuel power stations, so it's indirect. We purchase it rather than produce it. And we can begin to reduce our reliance on fossil fuel-generated power by reducing our energy use and by switching to a green tariff. So by switching to a green tariff, we are telling our energy providers that we want more renewables in the grid, and therefore they use our money to increase the investment in renewables. And by doing that, we're making a clear statement on the kind of power we want to be purchasing, because obviously all the power that comes into our homes, our theatres, it's all the same makeup. It's all the same percentage of renewables and fossil fuel generated power. So we need to encourage using our money to support the move towards renewable energy. And then scope 3 emissions, which we're very much concerned with in the Theatre Green Book, covers everything else. So in scope 3 emissions, we look at audience travel, employee commuting, business travel, transportation of sets and scenery, waste disposal, catering, marketing, mechanical and electrical equipment, water, show production, office equipment and services. So when we look at Scope 3 emissions, it can seem quite daunting. So the Theatre Green Book solution is to focus on what you can control and to use the 3 principles of the Theatre Green Book, which are reduce, source and reuse. So looking more directly at theatre now, where do theatre's emissions come from? They come from our transport, so touring, shipping of materials, audiences getting to our venues, the receiving and returning hires of equipment, from energy supplies, so front of house lights, stage lights, sound, AV equipment, building heating and lighting, cafe equipment, computers and office equipment, manufacturing, and things we use such as tape and cable, consumables we use. They also come from old unrecyclable tech, paper products such as programs, brochures, printing, purchase props and materials, manufacturing, and agriculture if we do have a cafe or something, our food from the cafes, also props and materials, so the wood for sets, canvas and other fabrics, all of this comes from agriculture. And then other things such as waste management, industrial processes and any public sector engagement. So which areas are within your control? So just taking a moment to look at these and think in terms of your role in your company or in your creative role, where can you control your Scope 3 emissions? And which area looks to be the most challenging? So a lot of this webinar will discuss how in these processes the Theatre Green Book operations guides you through reducing your impact and finding alternative ways to do things that can be more sustainable. Because you've chosen to click on this webinar, I'm going to assume you feel some kind of responsibility for the future of the Earth and the impact our practice has on it. So it seems most people are worried, but very few people know what to do about it, and the Theatre Green Book provides that guide, provides a framework for how we as an industry can make a change, how we can begin to act, and it creates a timeline for action that's achievable and ambitious. One of the main things we notice about climate action is inaction. And the time for just talking about things is long gone, and now is the time for action. Good intentions aren't enough anymore. According to this survey from our World in Data, the share of people who believe in climate change and think it's a serious threat to humanity, in Europe 80 to 90% of people believe in climate change and think it is a serious threat. And this was a survey of 60,000 participants across 63 countries. Closer to home, the EPA's Climate Change in the Irish Mind report earlier in 2024 states that most people in Ireland, 78%, say they know at least a moderate amount about climate change. Nearly all Irish people think it's happening and is caused in large part by human activities. 81% of people are worried. And Irish people are highly engaged on the topic of climate change. 89% say climate change is important to them personally, and 78% report that they often or occasionally discuss climate change with family and friends. So this is very much real and now, and these people, or at least some of them, are our audiences. So we have the power to make changes, both personally, professionally, and culturally. The Theatre Green Book the original Theatre Green Book began with this quote: "As storytellers, we have a unique capacity to explore key issues with audiences both on and off the stage. In a warming world, this means taking leadership and communicating the importance of environmental action, whether that be through the content of our projects or the sharing of our practice." So the cultural sector has a unique ability to imagine and experiment with alternative futures, to question the status quo, to see the world differently, and to explore with future audiences and participants. The Theatre Green Book began during COVID as a collective initiative by theatre makers in the UK, but it has grown now to involve theatre makers across the world. So international Theatre Green Book networks and partners are listed on that bottom left corner, And Ireland is now one of those partners, with Performing Arts Forum and Green Arts Initiative working on the Irish version, which you'll see presented alongside this webinar on the website. So what is the Theatre Green Book? The Theatre Green Book is a complete method for environmental sustainable theatre, a framework for planning sustainability, best practice guidance for every area, 3 standards on the path to net zero. So we're not expecting that everybody immediately cuts all their waste, all their emissions. What we're looking to do is find gradual improvements towards becoming more sustainable. It provides a measurement system to measure progress as well through spreadsheets, which you'll find a guide to also on the homepage for the Theatre Green Book. And it's based on practical expertise from theatre makers and reliable methodology from environmental sustainability experts, Bureau Happold. And it is designed to support work of any kind, so theatre, dance, opera, by anyone at any scale. The Theatre Green Book, while it began as 3 separate books on 3 separate areas, it's now amalgamated the 3: buildings, operations and production as a pathway to net zero. And while not all of this will be relevant to your role particularly, perhaps if you're involved in production, then you need to concern yourself with operations and productions. If you do have a theatre building, then you're looking at buildings and operations. And if you produce your own work within a theatre building, all 3 areas. We'll talk more about those targets as we go along. But the very first step is to commit. So our preliminary commitment, it's essential to make sure your environmental commitment is clear to everyone. Leadership is really key, but a senior team needs to decide which Theatre Green Book level to target, to make changes, to involve staff and report progress. So you have to be clear on the key actions needed to deliver measurable progress towards the environmental goal. So first off, committing to reducing your impact. Committing to the principles of source, reuse, so beginning the transition to net zero. Establish a green committee. So this will look different for every organisation. So it needs to include a sustainability lead, that's to oversee progress, a member of the senior leadership team, a lead for each area, so productions, operations and buildings, as it is for your organisation, and key staff members. So it really needs a team approach rather than one person becoming the sustainability police. And it depends also on who has the scope, who has the time and the space within their role already to become that sustainability lead. To agree an action plan, so setting out the steps you need to reach the next Green Book stage and a timescale to achieve it. So we'll all start at basic. What changes do you need to make to reach this level? And we'll examine these targets later on. If you're working solo or with a looser group of people, this might be about setting certain commitments on this one show or in this one year and sharing it with all the freelancers you engage with. Making a data plan to set out what you're going to measure and who's responsible. So who in your group is best resourced to do this? And then set a communications plan to explain how you'll share your targets and achievements, involving staff, partners and audiences. So who will you talk to internally and externally? How will you talk to them? How can you tell the world you're going green and make this a selling point? You need to be in a position to report and analyse your progress to achieve each Green Book standard. And sustainability ultimately needs a mindset shift and a cultural change, so good communication helps everyone to share the challenge. There are 3 basic principles that guide both buildings, operations and productions. To reduce how much you use, source what you do use as sustainably as possible, and given that climate isn't the only concern here, we're looking for social justice as well as climate justice, I like to add ethically, so sourcing ethically as well as sustainably, because the 2 really do go hand in hand. And recycle, so reuse or recycle everything you can, so thinking about circular economy. And we will talk a little bit more about that as well, particularly in the productions webinar. So following these 3 steps for the transition to net zero, it guides you through basic, intermediate and advanced for sustainable productions, sustainable operations, and sustainable buildings. And again, if you're only responsible for productions, you can be accredited based on solely production and operations. If you're based in a building, that also falls within your responsibility. If you are a theatre, which is a receiving house, you'll be concerned with buildings and operations. Everyone involved in the making of theatre when working with the Green Book will need to be aware of the standards and familiar with the guidance. And that's what these webinars are designed to do. So over the next hour, I'll talk through what this might look like for you, starting with operations, and then in the second webinar, looking at productions. The Theatre Green Book operations is broken down into 6 areas. So looking at these 6 areas, can you think about what it is you can control? Because again, this is the basic principle, is start with what you can control. Focus on what you can achieve. So looking at paper and digital, food, drink and retail, buildings management, travel and transport, reuse and recycling, and contracts. In our operations, we need to reduce how much we use, source what we use sustainably and ethically, reuse or recycle everything we can. And this is by no means, what follows is by no means a definitive list of suggested actions, but some of the most impactful. And obviously, if you have things to add within your organisation, that's also completely valid. So beginning with paper and digital. And this covers paper and printing front of house, so papers, posters, programmes and tickets, and printing of marketing materials. By switching to digital tickets and resources, you can cut paper. You can review your paper requirements to make sure there are no paperless alternatives. And obtain paper from a recycled source and recycle it after use. For example, a lot of paper which is printed on one side can still be used for note-taking or can still be used to print on the opposite side. You can also look at when you are printing using double-sided printing where possible. There's also zero and low carbon and recycled paper available, so Clee Paper are an excellent local supplier. You can look at use of paper tape instead of sellotape, or sellotape does now offer a plastic-free alternative, which is a bioplastic. And you don't need to cut out all paper use overnight because sustainability is a transition that can take time. And digital and paper operations can absolutely run in parallel. For example, programs can be made available online to help reduce printing, even if you know some of your audience will still want paper copies. So maybe you can find a way to allow people to request a paper program when booking, so that we can still meet people's accessibility needs while reducing waste. In terms of printing, the key thing is to make sure that you're printing only necessary quantities. So small repeat orders of programs can save you over-ordering. If you find yourself recycling large quantities of cast lists or programs after the production, then you're printing too much. You can also survey audiences to see if they have a preference for digital or paper programs. Marketing and posters are part of most campaigns, but they do have an environmental impact. So if you can choose a local printer who uses recycled papers and sustainable printing methods using non-toxic inks, that's preferable. And if you can also make sure that your environmental requirements, when you've created this sustainability policy or using this information to influence your choices, can you make environmental requirements part of any procurement process for printing? So paper and printing behind the scenes. Looking at scripts, things like meeting agendas. So scripts can be printed on request. I think we've all been in a rehearsal room where there's a floor covered in first draft scripts on the first day of rehearsals, beautifully bound. And while that is necessary for some people, it's maybe not necessary for everyone. So can you allow script printing to be done on request? Can small changes mean that maybe one page is reprinted rather than a reissue of the script each week? And some people are now happy to work with digital scripts. Some of the creative team might be happy with digital scripts. Maybe even some of the cast are happier working off their phone or some kind of tablet. And then schedules and meeting agendas. So schedules are often printed multiple times when they could often be shared digitally. And meetings don't need copies of agendas and minutes for everyone anymore. Cut down on paper use through printing policies that require double-sided printing, ensure staff minimize how much they print. And central printers, if you have more than one workstation in an office or in a building, can be helpful in encouraging people to print less. People would tend to print less if there's an inconvenience of having to walk to a central printer instead of collect it off your desk. So making sure that printing and paper supplies are also sustainably sourced. On digital, unfortunately, digital is not a zero carbon alternative. The internet, email, and cloud-based services cause substantial carbon emissions in manufacturing, powering, and cooling computers and data centers. So active digital management is needed to minimize your digital footprint. Without your knowing it, your website may have a large carbon footprint, and there are online carbon calculators that can help you understand it. There's a website called websitecarbon.com that is a very quick and easy guide to looking at how much data your website is using, where it is using it, and how to minimize that. So you can manage it in a couple of ways: choosing an internet provider who offers a sustainable operation, such as GreenGeeks, or minimize internet page numbers and data size. So the larger the images you're hosting on your website, the more data you're taking up. The operations tracker, which you can look at in that separate webinar, contains suggestions of how to reduce your data size. So movies consume storage capacity, so consider how you make use of them. Images can be stored at higher resolution than the internet actually needs, so you can reduce them in size. You don't need to keep obsolete pages, instead they can be archived. So your website isn't an attic with infinite capacity, and you need to manage it. In terms of digital communications, so that carries its own carbon footprint, and too many emails both do us damage but also damage the planet. And most emails don't need to be stored. So can you establish guidelines for deletion? Can you unsubscribe from all of those newsletters that you don't even read? Once you've made a policy around digital, you need to make sure it's communicated with staff and that everyone understands it. In terms of storage, data storage, for most organizations, digital storage grows every year, and we've got used to this idea that digital means we can keep things forever, but it's both a logistical nightmare and a nightmare for sustainability. So keeping multiple copies of a large document increases digital storage exponentially. If you're editing a promotional film, it's not uncommon to save copies to edit progresses, but saved copies can stay on the server or in the cloud for years. So can you initiate a review of current storage and discard unneeded files, and then establish clear guidance for everyone into reducing digital storage? So just a little bit more on this. Thinking about, again, the basic principles. In terms of paper and digital, we're looking to review, reduce, and recycle. And again, thinking of circularity. How can we keep things in circulation for longer? And just a quick look at the carbon footprint of our digital world, because it can feel very alien and far removed and difficult to understand. So I think the most shocking one to me has always been the final one, and this information comes from Mike Berners-Lee book, How Bad Are Bananas?, which is the carbon footprint of everything, if anyone feels like going down that wormhole. An email blast that takes 10 minutes to write, sent to 100 people, of whom one reads it, and the other 99 glance at it for 3 seconds to decide they should ignore it. 26 grams of CO2 equivalent. And that's compared to a letter sent in the post. And this covers the paper, the postage, the transport, 20 grams of CO2 equivalent. And if you look higher up on that list, a short email sent and received on a phone is 0.2 grams of carbon, where a short email sent and received on a laptop is 0.3. A long email, 17 grams. So you can see how this starts to add up. The other thing that allows this to add up is our habit of hitting reply all to say thank you. So if you're sent a document, for example, a production schedule, and it arrives in your inbox, and then you hit reply all to say, thanks for that, you're then recirculating that to all 17 people on the email list, or 40 people, whatever it is. And the more people who hit reply all of that information continues to bounce around. So think about, do you need to reply all? Can you just reply to sender? Can you establish a policy where no one says thank you and we just know we all mean thank you? And where you do need to reply, can you select the recipients? Another useful thing which Katrina Fallon from Green Arts Initiative in Ireland has as an email signature is the reminder, have you cleaned out your inbox and junk email folder recently? Reduce the carbon footprint of your online activity by deleting old and unwanted emails and unsubscribing from emails you don't read. So what that does is issues a reminder, a friendly reminder, to check. When I presented this webinar to a group recently, someone emailed me afterwards to tell me they just deleted 16,000 emails. And if you're aware of 16,000 emails in your inbox, maybe in your spare time, you could think about starting to empty those out. But also to unsubscribe from the unnecessary things you don't read anymore. For example, we all, or many of us, will sign up for a 10% discount and then continue to get a newsletter from that company for months after we've used the company once with our 10% discount. So really consider the impact of that when you become aware of those carbon emissions associated with that. And one of the things that's contributing to that carbon footprint of our digital world is the use of data centers. So everything we do online has a footprint. The majority of things we do online are stored in data centers. So emails, YouTube, Netflix, our history, everything, the cloud. And in 2023, data centers used 21% of Ireland's electricity, compared to all the residential properties in Ireland, which is 28% of usage. And the power consumption by data centers has risen by 473% since 2015. So streaming services such as Netflix or Amazon Prime account for 50 to 60% of all data center electricity usage because video and graphics are very data intensive. And if we want to meet our climate targets, we need to decarbonize our electricity network. Similar to a computer's external hard drive that holds your documents, data centers store the data information behind every action you take online. And as more of our day-to-day lives move online, data centers become more necessary. And according to International Energy Agency, data centers consume nearly 1% of global electricity demand. But to give you a more local example, and this is from Dr. Patrick Bresnahan of NUI Maynooth, in one day, an average data center alone uses the same amount of energy as a town the size of Kilkenny, and up to 500,000 litres of water to cool down its systems. That's every day. Potentially up to 5 million litres of water during a heat wave. And Ireland has become home to many, many data centres because of our temperate climate, because cooling of the data centres is easier in our climate. But what it is doing is zapping our grid and meaning that we need to import more of our electricity, and that electricity is not yet renewable. So moving on to food, drink and retail, which might not be relevant to your operation, and if it isn't, you can choose to ignore this. So a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions come from food, and a half of this is from animal products. So the key principles for catering are to look at local, seasonal, ethically sourced food, reducing food waste, and choosing and managing equipment sustainably so that your equipment lasts longer. Sustainable catering services and packaging as well. So prioritizing plant-based ingredients, ensuring unavoidable food waste is sent for composting, looking at clear labeling of bins so that people know where to put their food waste, because contaminated single-use containers put in the recycling contaminate the recycling bin. So ideally you're looking at, if you do need single-use products, that you're looking at things that are compostable and then providing compost facilities. So you can think local, avoid single-use and maintain equipment are the keynotes there. Moving on to buildings management. So theatre buildings are among theatre's greatest carbon impacts. The transition to net zero depends on reducing how much energy they use. So sustainable buildings is the final section of the Theatre Green Book and is about how to upgrade buildings to make them fit for purpose in the climate emergency. So if you have an office or a theatre building, you can look more into this sustainable buildings section. but it is the least likely, I suppose, to be within your control as a role of a producer or creative, but might be within your influence. So thinking about electricity, power and light, can it be decarbonized? In terms of heating, which is predominantly gas and oil, that's more difficult to decarbonize. And thinking about a green tariff again, which is preferable to green a green tariff, which is preferable to thinking about choosing an energy provider with a green tariff so that there's more pressure to decarbonize the grid by investing in green energy. But again, just signposting you to sustainable buildings if you feel that buildings management is within your remit. So moving on to travel and transport. And travel and transport, I suppose, is a big one for us. We can support sustainable travel choices for audiences and staff, and for visitors, including artists and freelancers. We can feel often that travel and transport are out of our control, and it can be also an emotive issue for the arts sector because there is a huge focus on international travel and mobility. So it's important to begin to measure our travel and to start making decisions based on that. We can control some areas of travel. We can control our staff travel. We can encourage smarter travel by visitors. And we can also not control our audience travel, but we can encourage and support more sustainable alternatives to individual car travel. The most sustainable ways to reach a theatre involve walking, cycling, public transport, and electric vehicles. In terms of transport, we're looking at deliveries, touring, reducing the number of journeys and journey times. And we're just going to go a little bit into this, even though it does focus a lot on sustainable productions within sustainable productions. I'm just going to take a little look at travel and transport within operations. So the travel of audiences, there are sustainable travel options. So can you provide information to your audience about the sustainable way to get to your venue in your marketing? Can you incentivize the use of public transport, for example, offering a discount at the bar with a Lewis ticket? Can you survey audiences to find your starting point? So how are people traveling to your venue already? Are shows at times that public transport serves? Can you survey people after the event to find out how they're getting there? In terms of staff travel, can you look at flexible working to reduce commuting? Can you have video calls instead of long distance journeys for one meeting in a building? Looking at time management to reduce the number of long distance journeys. So can a single journey be planned to serve multiple meetings? Particularly when you're working with freelancers who aren't necessarily based in the city centre, maybe where the core staff are, is it possible to allow an option to join by Zoom? Can you reduce single journeys in taxis? Sustainable travel options can be promoted and incentivized by things like the Cycle to Work scheme. You could provide more secure bike storage and tools for bike repair. And then subsidizing local transport bus passes, etc. So thinking about maybe tax saver and things like that. And then timing meetings to help staff avoid rush hour. By creating a green travel plan, you can gather staff and audience travel into one guide that fits for your organisation, and that will look different for everyone. It will look different for urban centres, it'll look different for someone who's based more rurally, where everybody does need to use a personal vehicle. But it is about reflecting on what you're already doing and where there is room for improvement. And then sharing that guide with staff, with freelancers, with audiences. In terms of transport and deliveries, we're looking more at consolidating deliveries, discuss shipping and transport options with suppliers. So ask them, how are they shipping your things? If it's by air travel, can you look at a different supplier? Can you share with them your sustainability journey and ask that they come on board with that? Can you think about the origin of materials? Is it coming from the closest location possible? With online ordering, can you read the shipping policies? Are there other companies that are using the same suppliers and transport routes, and can you connect? So thinking about touring networks, thinking about the festival circuit. Can you share transport so there's one truck going with 3 shows in it instead of one truck per show? And then thinking about touring. So touring is part of theatre's ecosystem. And this is from the Green Book. It's innately sustainable since it helps each production reach more people. So we mustn't stop touring. Touring will become easier as more sustainable freight options become available. But right now, we need to be aware that the touring footprint is directly related to increased mileage. More distance travelled by less sustainable transport mode has a larger impact on the environment. So on tour, can you book accommodation close to the venue to avoid taxi and car journeys? Can you lift share or carpool where possible? Can you work to identify the most efficient tour routes to allow for public transport? Can you consider the show time, so does it link in with public transport timetables? And can you choose the greenest accommodation option available? On some booking sites, you can select sustainability certification as a search criteria. Then thinking about company travel, can car journeys be reduced? Can meetings be held online? Can you support cast, crew and staff to access productions using rail and public transport? And budgeting for the time and cost of tickets as necessary. So can you encourage people, for example, travelling from Dublin to Kerry, that we will only reimburse travel for buses and trains once you've allowed for the time for that, rather than paying for a flight from Dublin to Kerry? And then can you consider travel options, so car, rail, ferry, and encourage best practice? So there is a green touring rider included on the Theatre Green Book UK website that's linked here. And that's useful in looking at what you are encouraging venues to do, but also what you're taking responsibility for yourself. So one of the things that we need to talk about when we think about touring is air travel. So aviation accounts for 2.5% of global emissions, but 5% of global warming. And that is because cirrus cloud formation and the release of water vapor and nitrous oxide at high altitudes have a much greater warming effect than at low altitudes. 1% of the world's population accounts for 50% of aviation emissions. Planes emit 20 to 50 times more CO2 than trains. So rail is unbeatable in terms of CO2 emissions compared with air travel. Carbon offsetting isn't really a solution. Recently, so earlier this year in October, to keep global warming within the guardrails of the Paris Agreement, the timeframe is now so tight that there is no space for companies to use offsetting to continue high carbon activities. We need to turn the fossil fuel taps off, all of them. And that's from scientists reporting on offsetting in The Guardian. And what all of this shows us is that air travel is not a sustainable solution, and air travel has to be really carefully considered. So if international touring is important to your company, to you, can you look at the best way to do this? Can you look at getting the best out of one flight rather than back and forth from the US, for example? And then just considering what the actual carbon impact of a flight is. So this is a huge challenge. Anyone who's ever looked at the carbon emissions based on a single flight can see that this is a problem. So this is an example of Dublin to London Gatwick, a return flight. So my flight is 0.343 tons of CO2. In order to stop climate change, the maximum amount of CO2 that can be generated by a single person in a year is 0.6, which would be the equivalent of 2 return flights between Dublin and London, plus all your other things. That is entire amount of CO2 generation, not just from air travel. And the average amount of CO2 generated by a single person in the EU is 7.2 tons of CO2e. So you can see just how far we need to go. This information is from co2.myclimate.org, which is flight calculators, just looking at individual flight calculators. And then I thought I'd look at Dublin to JFK in New York, so a return flight again. 1.8 tons of CO2 for each flight. And then I considered a small tour, so thinking about Dublin to London for 8 people. And this is from directferries.co.uk, where there is a carbon footprint calculator. So looking at that, we see that per person by train and ferry is 5.2 kilos, 92.9% fewer emissions than flying. This is a tour of 8 people. 8.8 kilos by electric car and ferry, 16.9 kilos by petrol car and ferry, and then 72.3 kilos per person by short haul flight. Now, we might look at that and think, well, that's a very obvious solution. We should all do train and ferry. And then it's where we meet the obstacle of time, where it takes 8 hours 20 by train and ferry versus 4 hours, which I've included the time in the airport and transit to the city for a flight from Dublin to London. So that's London. If you're going to Wales or Liverpool or Manchester, it isn't so long because you arrive off the ferry and you're closer to the centre, whereas travelling to London is a long commute by train also. So assuming, because we live on an island, that air travel is somewhat unavoidable for a lot of us, this is the Green Book guide. Some general considerations. So if flying is the only option, can you avoid connecting flights? So take the nearest direct flight and add on a rail journey rather than a second flight. Maybe you can fly one way if you're in a hurry and travel the other by rail, which is still an improvement on flying both ways. So it's not asking us to completely eliminate air travel, it's asking us to consider our choices. Using economy class, increased seating density reduces carbon consumed. Use airlines with the newest plane models which produce lower emissions, and avoid very small or very large planes. Reduce luggage and encourage hand luggage, unless luggage is being used as a freight substitute, which it can be on smaller tours. If flying is necessary, consider ways to maximize the value. So spend more time at the destination, stage more performances, become embedded in the local community so that the cultural exchange can still happen or can happen in a very real way. If flying, arrange airport transfers using public transport or arrange flights so that people arrive together and travel as a group in a single vehicle rather than several trips. Recognize that driving is preferable to flying in terms of carbon consumption if trains are not an option. And calculate carbon consumption versus trains and cars and share it with everyone relevant so the impact of travel is truly understood. So if you're reading this and you're thinking, I knew air travel was bad, but I didn't know how bad it was, then think about everyone else you work with, everyone who's engaged in the process of touring or transport and travel for your organisation. And maybe they're also not aware of the impact of air travel over the impact of rail and those alternatives. So a lot to consider in the area of travel and transport. Looking now at something maybe that feels more familiar to us, so reuse and recycling. So the Theatre Green Book sets out a waste hierarchy. We look at first preventing, then reuse, then recycling, recovery, and then disposal. So to prevent, is it essential? Can we eliminate waste at source, such as single-use plastics? Reuse, does it exist already? So paper use and reuse, do you already have a product that can be used for this purpose, even if it's not specifically designed for it? It's the difference between buying plastic containers to store your food rather than reusing something you have already. Recycling, can you choose a supplier who'll take back packaging? Can you look at staff training around recycling? So are you recycling the optimum amount in your organisation? Do you have sufficient bins and signage? And does everybody understand what actually goes in each bin? Thinking about recovery. So waste contains energy and some materials can be recovered. For example, wood waste for biomass. So when you're finished with wooden items, can they go in a wood skip rather than a general skip so that you know they're being responsibly disposed of? And then disposal, putting in the bin as being the last resort. Can you begin to think in a circular way? And what does that mean? What does circular thinking mean? So this is an extract again from the Green Book. We look at raw materials, then the design stage. So we design raw materials into a product. They're manufactured, distributed, used, hopefully reused or repaired, then collected as waste and recycled and back into that cycle. But every product needs energy in its creation, and every single thing produced has a carbon footprint in its manufacture. To embrace the idea of circularity and reduce our impact on the environment, we need to consider this in all our decision making. 80% of emissions can be saved at the design stage. By using less materials and using them better, we save emissions. By using them for longer, we save emissions. And why is this important right now? Why this focus on circularity? Well, for the first time in the planet's history, we now have more man-made massive materials on this Earth than we do biomass. And this is clearly unsustainable. And I think looking at this graphic, we all know which way we're still tipping. So we need to focus on what stuff we actually need. And rather than recycling our way out of the problem, we need to keep the things we have in circulation for longer. We'll focus a lot more on stuff in the Production Handbook webinar. Moving on now to contracts. So, can you find businesses and suppliers with the same green ethos as you? And if you need to define the standards for yourself, make sure they cover the origin of products, so where they're originally manufactured and where the materials come from. Consider delivery and transport methods and packaging, and also certification. Sometimes it can be difficult to know the difference between green and greenwashing. You can look at whether companies are using carbon offsets or actually looking to reduce their emissions. In green procurement, there's an excellent webinar available on the Arts Council website that's linked in the resources at the end of this. And there's also more on contracts in the Production Handbook. So when we think about contracts, we think about the power of our spend. We think about what we choose to spend money on, and can that be a more sustainable and more ethical choice? So if you choose recycled paper, for example, it increases the demand for paper to be recycled. So it drives up the cost of waste and creates an incentive to businesses to recycle paper, because profit is still king, even if some of us wish it wasn't. Meaningful progress on the climate emergency comes from better actions and not just better intentions. So if you've limited time and resources, can you identify the actions in which you have most impact? So thinking local and ethical, is it green or is it greenwashing? So concluding that look at the operations, we'll start to delve into the standards. So the key is still, don't waste time on things you can't control. To achieve basic Theatre Green Book standard, we need to reach basic level in 4 of these 6 areas that we've just examined. So you can see these areas listed on the right-hand side of your screen. So we want to plan for sustainable organisation first. So that is part of going back to our preliminary commitment. Establish a green committee and staff sustainability network. Set a timescale to achieve basic standard. And then communicate your sustainability goals and systems to staff, visitors and the public, engaging audiences on the journey. And then step 2, between step 2 and step 7, where we need to find 4 areas that we can make real progress, and that's what will achieve basic standards on the Theatre Green Book operations end. So managing in paper and digital, make a plan and timetable to reduce paper and switch to digital alternatives for tickets, documents, etc. And then make a plan and timetable to make digital systems sustainable. So using those resources provided earlier, using those suggestions provided earlier in the webinar. Managing food, drink and retail, and again, this might not be something that applies to you and therefore it won't be one of your 4 areas. So make a plan and timetable to manage food and drink outlets sustainably. If you have a restaurant or staff canteen, make 20% of starters and mains veggie or vegan. Make a plan and timetable to reduce single-use plastics in your front and back of house operations. Managing buildings, again, this might be one that isn't relevant to you. Record energy readings every month, train staff and visitors in energy-saving behaviour, and set controls, timers and thermostats to minimise energy use, particularly at times where the building is not in use. Managing waste, separate waste between recycling, general waste, and ideally compost, and measure both. Managing travel and transport, so providing staff, artists, visitors and audiences with information on sustainable transport options. record business travel using the travel calculator, which we'll look at in the guide to the operations tracker. Prepare a deliveries plan to consolidate and reduce deliveries and share it with every department. And then contracts and procurement include sustainability criteria in procuring major suppliers and contractors, include sustainability standards in major contracts. And that's also down to just making those wiser choices we've discussed this morning. And that's also just down to making wiser choices, as discussed earlier. So that is basic. So you can see at basic level, a lot of it is about making a plan, committing, and then starting to communicate around these issues, around these areas. When we move on to intermediate, this is about developing your sustainable organisation. And this time we need to reach intermediate in at least 4 of the 6 areas. So this involves climate literacy training for at least 25% of staff. And there are climate literacy programs available online. I'll also provide a link to Julie's Bicycle Climate Literacy 101 training that's specific to the theatre industry. Communicate your Theatre Green Book experience to other theatres. So a large part of our movement towards sustainable practices is sharing of information, discussing challenges, meeting people who are on the same journey as us, and finding ways that we can continue that journey together. Managing paper and digital, so implementing your plan to reduce paper and switch to sustainable printing. Implement your plan to make digital systems sustainable. Then managing food, drink and retail, you can see that's implement the plan. Managing buildings, make a full analysis of energy use for each part of the building. So only by finding a baseline do we know where we are. And that's all available in the buildings guide as part of the Theatre Green Book as well. Make a plan for further reductions in energy use using the findings of the analysis. Managing waste, eliminate waste to landfill. So can you make a plan to reduce waste and increase recycling, increase composting? So make sure that you're streaming your waste as it leaves your building or your operation. Managing travel and transport, so surveying the audience to find out how they travel so that you can encourage them to make different, better choices. Make a sustainable travel plan, including a limit on air travel. Implement your deliveries plan, so reducing the annual carbon footprint of deliveries. And then contracts and procurement, make a sustainable procurement policy. So define standards for all purchases. And then we move to advanced. So by advanced level, we're really very close to net zero. So this is arrange climate literacy for at least 75% of staff. Publish your carbon footprint every year. Complete your plan to reduce paper, switch to sustainable printing, complete your plan to make digital systems. So you'll see this is all complete your plans. Managing buildings, switch to a green energy supplier or an energy supplier which provides green tariffs. Implement your plan for energy reductions. In waste, complete the plan to minimize waste. Incentivize audiences to travel sustainably. Implement your sustainable travel plan. Minimize carbon footprint of your deliveries. And require all major suppliers and contractors to comply with key performance indicators for sustainability. So, advanced and intermediate may seem a long way off and may currently seem a bit blue sky thinking, but what we're really focusing on is our first steps. So our planning to reduce things, our commitments, our really firm commitments to action, and beginning with maybe smaller actions. So looking at paper waste, is it easy to switch to digital tickets? Things that are maybe low cost and very achievable. So if you can take a moment before you switch this off to think about what could be easy wins for your organisation. Where can you affect the most immediate change? And if you need to scroll back and look at earlier sections on each of these areas, hopefully that will provide you with a guide to thinking, yes, that's achievable. That sounds like something I can do. That sounds like something I could lead on. And the hope is that, again, we can look at what you can control as a very good starting point. If you need further guidance or you have more questions, you can consult the other webinars provided alongside the Theatre Green Book on the Performing Arts Forum website, or you can contact Green Arts Initiative to look for any additional support. The resources provided here link to the Theatre Green Book Irish edition, performingartsforum.ie/the Theatre Green Book Irish edition, the UK edition, which comes with a lot of resources in the background, a lot of very detailed information, some of which was presented in this webinar. Green Arts Initiative Ireland for other green arts initiatives, such as they've done a touring project, a Green Arts Centres project, so a lot of great work happening there. Julie's Bicycles Creative Climate Tools, which are really useful in looking at measurement tools. And then the Arts Council Climate Action webinar series, which is available at that link there, to look at all the different areas in which we can improve our sustainability in the arts sector. So thank you very much for watching this webinar. Again, if you need further information, you can consult the Operations Tracker Guide, which is provided alongside this operations webinar, the production guidebook webinar, and then the production calculator alongside that. Thank you very much.